So it's been a week of economy, business, budget, revenue headlines, all of them. So to help us understand exactly what these numbers mean in plain English and what the federal government's claims mean for regular people, we're now being joined here on Newsday by the economist Johnson Chukwu. It's good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, as I was saying, this has been a week of what feels like back-to-back headlines on the economy that we've heard from the administration. And a big one was the presidency explaining that for 2025, they had projected that revenues would grow by 16%. But they said that as of August, they exceeded those targets, getting to 40%. So we know that this is what the administration has said, but if we want to look ahead, what does this really mean? Does this mean that for the rest of the year, they're good? They've exceeded the revenue target, so that's it?
Well, if you look at what the president said, that they have exceeded the non-oil revenue target, or that they've achieved the non-oil revenue target for the entire year by August. Well, that means that if you look at the budget for 2025, the government had budgeted about 41.9 trillion naira. Of that 41.9 trillion, about 22.9 trillion naira was non-oil revenue. Well, as oil revenue was about 19.1 trillion or thereabout. So what they are saying is that they've earned over 22.9 trillion naira between January and the month of August. If you consider the fact that there are two major components of the government revenue. So you are pursuing, your intention is to achieve 41 trillion. Okay, you've achieved 22 trillion. You still have about 19 trillion, or about almost 20 trillion, about 19 trillion to achieve. The government did not talk about how far it had gone in achieving the oil revenue, which looks very Herculean to achieve. Because if you look at the parameters upon which the budget is premised on, which is that we're going to produce about 2.06 million barrels a day, and that we're going to sell the crude at an average of $75 per barrel. As at the end of June, our average production was about 1.78 million barrels a day, which is the best we've achieved so far this year. So it simply means we're likely going to be recording shortfalls in non-oil revenue. So overall, the government wouldn't have achieved this budgetary revenue projections. What they are just saying that we've achieved the one aspect of it, but we've not achieved the other aspect of it. Assuming they achieve the entire revenue projections, what should follow is that we should see that reflected in government expenditure. Government had a budget about 45.9 trillion naira, 99 trillion naira, 54.99 trillion naira as expenditure for this year. After making provision about 13 trillion deficit. So it then means that if government achieves its borrowing target, it should meet all projections in the expenditure budget, which we know is not being done. So there is still a huge gap in government revenue because we are not very much unlikely to achieve the revenue projections from oil.
What makes you say that? What makes you say that we're unlikely to?
Yeah, because the assumptions are very clear. Like I said, the best we've achieved in crude oil production was about 1.78 million barrels a day. Your projection is 2.06 million barrels a day. That's more than 200,000 barrels shortfall. Beyond that, oil had not averaged about $75 per barrel. The government has expected that oil will average about $75 per barrel. So if you look at, we have what they call negative price variance and negative volume variance. If you sum up those negative variances, you are likely going to see that government will be far behind in achieving the 19.1 trillion naira have budgeted for oil, from oil income. So if we first achieve that, you are still going to have a huge gap. Assuming that government has achieved its non-oil revenue for the entire year at about 22 trillion. What that means in 8 months, what that means is government is doing over 2 trillion in a month. So assuming it's doing about 2 trillion in a month, it needs to do for the remaining 5 months of the year, it needs to take in about 10 trillion. So would that 10 trillion be enough to cover up the shortfall in oil revenue? That question still needs to be answered. So unless that is achieved, then we not challenge the government, then we must ensure that we implement the budget fully. But second factor that we have to bear in mind is that there are 3 budgets running concurrently. So revenue is only one stream coming. So even if you achieve the revenue projections for 2025, Where will you get the revenue to fund the other two budgets that are running concurrently that have extended their life? So head or tail, we still have a revenue challenge. But that does not take away the fact that government has done a lot to improve non-oil tax revenue. We must give them credit for that. But the other factor related to governance that we also have to deal with, issue of improving the standard of living of Nigerians, focusing what they call getting value for money. Where are we investing the resources that government is mobilizing as it affects the citizens? So that's the next level of that discussion.
And that's great, because that's kind of what my second question is. The fact that there's a sentiment that a lot of regular people aren't really feeling the effects of these announcements that have come from this administration. As an economist, I know you can't see into the future, but hopefully you can tell us, when, if we're looking at timelines, when can we expect to see fuel prices come down, food prices come down, things like real things that people can measure in their day-to-day lives, if at all?
The truth is that you talk of food prices, fuel prices coming down. Two factors will drive down fuel prices. Some of them are completely, two of them are actually outside the control of the country, unless we go back to a regulated area of fuel pricing. First is crude price, international crude price. That is outside what we control. The second one is our exchange rate. Our exchange rate cannot be legislated. It has to be driven by our earnings, foreign exchange earnings, and foreign exchange reserve. And our foreign exchange earnings had built up reasonably, but it's driven by by foreign portfolio investment. It's not driven so much from our creation from our international trade. Of course, we all know that international trade has also turned positive. Balance of trade. We had about 5 trillion naira positive balance of trade in the first quarter of this year. But that is not enough to explain the increment we recorded in our reserve. So two factors will drive down crude price, drive down pump price: exchange rate and PLAT, or international crude price. The international crude price is outside our control. So until that happens, you're not going to go to a filling station and get fuel at materially lower price. But we've seen some moderation in exchange rate. The other factor, which is issue of food inflation, which is what hurts Nigerians most, because if you look at an average household consumption, more than 50% of it is on food or food-related items. So we need to produce more food. We've seen food inflation drop to about 21.78% in the month of July, but that is not enough. Your income has not increased by that. It simply means that between December this year and July this year, an average household can only afford 3/4. For fifth, 4/5 of what they used to enjoy based on their income. They can no longer buy 100% of what they were buying in January. And that's why Nigerian households are hurting. Because when you have a food inflation of about 20% or 22%, then means that your income ought to have increased by about that rate for you to still go to the market and buy the same quantity of food stuff or goods that you used to buy. If that has not happened, you see that your standard of living had deteriorated by an average of 20% in the past 8 months.
But so how should Nigerians be thinking about these figures? How should we be thinking about what will happen between now and the end of the year? Is there any reprieve, or that's something that will still take longer to actually see?
Well, the reprieve will come to average household when inflation moderates further. Inflation is moderating. Inflation has to moderate to the level that average household income is increasing at the rate higher than the rate of inflation. That's a very key component to make sure that standard of living is improving. If the average price levels are still increasing at the rate higher than the rate at which household income is increasing, households will continue to hurt. So that will take some time to achieve. But we must also recognize the fact that there are some green shoots. There are some improvement. Those improvements has not cascaded into households feeling it. But we must continue to see those improvements on a consistent basis. We must see inflation continue to moderate. It started at 24.5%. In January, it's about 21.88% in July. That moderation must continue. We should see Naira continue to appreciate. And then we should see improvement in food production, particularly from the food belts of this country, from those areas that are highly affected by insecurity. Those three factors are critical for Nigerians to feel the impact of a stabilizing economy.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir, for joining us and offering all of your incredible economic insights, especially on a week like this. They're highly valued. So thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.